The problem, the most important difficult obstacle in the path of the research on early Indian cinema, especially the silent period, is that most of the material is lost. Unlike the West, we have not preserved the examples of our early films. So what we have is just a handful of films. Most of what has survived from that period actually is the work of Dada Saheb Phalke, which is a well-known name because we celebrated the 100 years of Indian cinema just 1 year ago with Dada Saheb Phalke's first feature film, Raja Harishchandra, in mind. So when we celebrated the centenary, we celebrated the 100 years of Raja Harishchandra's appearance, which was in 1913, 1-3. Now we have that, and we have a bit of, a few small reels and sections from other films made in various parts of the country, especially in Bombay. One example from the South, a film made by the Christian missionaries. Only one example actually from Bengal, which is a late example of silent cinema, which has accidentally survived, a film called Jamai Babu, which was made in 1931, the year when sound came to Indian cinema. Silent films were still being made because everybody was not prepared to make sound films. So Jamai Babu is a two-reeler short comedy that was made in that year, 1931. So it's a late silent kind of film. But if we look at the Dada Saheb Phalke films, or one or two examples from Kanjibai Rathore or Agarwal films and so on, some stunt films, some costume drama that has survived, we will see that they also have, this is not the exact early cinema period that we kind of marked for the Western cinema, American and European, West European cinema. We said it's between 1895 and roughly 1906-7, if you like, 1908. But in our case, of course, the timeline, the time period has to be readjusted. We don't really have a clear-cut transition from early cinema to transition cinema, someone like Griffith, and then to institutional narration. It hasn't happened that way in India. It doesn't have to happen everywhere in the same manner. But what we have from the early silent period bears ample evidence that some of the early cinema narrative techniques were used in those films also. For example, in Dada Saheb Phalke, you have a lot of tableau composition, where the one piece of action, that is to say something that in later cinema, we would divide up into various shots and create a sequence. That action is presented in just one shot, one frame, one unchanging, static, composition. And the tendency of actors to sometimes enter the frame and exit the frame, right, like a stage. So tableau, frontality, characters kind of tending to turn towards the audience, even when they're talking to each other, they would turn their bodies towards the camera. These tendencies are very much there. And the concurrent relative absence of continuity editing, which is basically cutting up a single action into various shots and then joining them together in order to maintain a continuity. In Raja Harishchandra, for example, but there is a mix. In Raja Harishchandra, you will find that the initial scenes, before the Raja, the king Harishchandra leaves for the forest, first time, to go on a hunting expedition. You'll see that the scenes are all inside the palace, all kind of static, one shot, one sequence, one action, complete. But as it comes out of the interior space, the studio space. Dadasaheb Phalke shot them partly on real location. And that was a practice with many early silent cinema practitioners. Because in any case, there was a problem of electrical lighting in the studio. So compared to the initial period of sound cinema, actually silent cinema used to shoot on real location or some kind of an outdoor location, if not real, quite often. So when Raja Harishchandra comes out of the palace with his entourage and heads for the forest where he would go for a hunt, in the early parts of Raja Harishchandra, Dadasaheb Phalke's 1913 first feature film, you see 3-4 shots which are continuity shots. So they come from left-hand side of the frame, they exit right. Next shot, they come from left again, they exit right. So that happens to 3-4 shots. But then the question of mixing the technique of this continuity technique, which appears very briefly, immediately gets mixed with or combined with some kind of a typical early cinema kind of narration. So as Raja Harishchandra enters the forest, he comes to a halt because he hears a woman cry. There's a female voice that he hears. But he stands there and the whole shot is static and he hears like that on two sides. That's not possible. In film, you have to always identify properly the source of the sound. In the sense that if it is coming from the left, then of course the action will now, refer to the left or move to the left. Or maybe you will soon see who is there to the left of the king. But he is listening to it almost like a space, though it's a real forest, suddenly becomes a stage-like thing, a stage-like space. So then he tries to locate the voice, and he arrives at this sage Vishwamitra performing a ritual where Raja Harishchandra will be cursed. Vishwamitra will curse him for spoiling the ritual. So he arrives at Vishwamitra's ritual in the next shot without any sense of continuity. How far is it? Is it to where he stood last time in the forest? Is it to his left? Is it to his right? How far is it? How did he? There's no explanation for that. So once again it has become a stage. He just moves from one place to another place as if this is one kind of stage, that is another kind of stage. And of course that's another static shot. The ritual happens. Raja Harishchandra does something. He spoils the ritual. Vishwamitra appears and starts cursing him. So this is an example of how often a bit of continuity narration technique will be mixed with non-continuity, early cinema, tableau-like technique. Or if you think of the slightly later film, 1917, Sri Krishna Janma, the first scene of that film about the birth of Sri Krishna, you see the miracle-like thing happening on the river. You see Vishnu sitting on this huge serpent with Lakshmi. You see Vishnu's avatar, Sri Krishna, appearing, or on that serpent a little later, it's young Krishna. And you see these people of this group of devotees standing on the banks of the river, looking at this whole miracle happening on the waters. And it seems like this short counter shot. Sometimes you see the miracle from the devotee's point of view. Sometimes you see the devotees from the opposite point of view. Now this is again a typical later cinema technique. When narrative develops in the institutional mode as against the primitive mode, PMR to IMR as we have called it before, following Noel Birch, as narrative develops, this short counter shot comes into play as a crucial kind, as a very important mode of following action, dialogue, conversation, and so on. So is it short counter shot in 1917 in Dadasaheb Phalke? Now there is the catch. If you notice carefully the material of the film, because it's mythic material, it's taken from all sorts of Puranas, mythic sources. it is not possible to imagine that Sri Krishna and the human beings on the banks of the river, Krishna here and the people there, they don't belong to the same order of reality. He is a god and they are mortal beings. The space where the miracle is happening, the waters, is some kind of a sacred, miraculous, magical space. It cannot be the everyday, ordinary space as the one that the devotees occupy. That's not possible. In order to have a proper continuity, moving one person moving from this room to next room to another building, or a short reverse shot, which is two people sitting on two sides of a table, you cut from one to another, cut back to the first one. This is called short reverse shot. That can only happen when space is itself homogeneous. It has the same quality everywhere. Space is space. You can measure it by foot, by meter, by square foot. You can measure it by height, by width. Space is space. But a miracle space, a magical space, cannot be measured. You can't say the space of a miracle, a space that the gods occupy, right? Or 1,000 square feet. This is absurd. So the same kind of space on two sides is something that cannot be true. So it is actually a short reverse shot, looks like a short reverse shot, technically a short reverse, but not in a narrative sense. The narrative mode and the technical device are not the same things. In early cinema in the West, there are many examples, very early, even in 1897-98, as early as that, there are examples of big close shots. It's not true, as people thought for a long time, that D.W. Griffith introduced the close-up. It's not true. It has been found that close shots have been there for a very long time, before Griffith. But critics have pointed out, scholars like Tom Gunning and others have pointed out, that if you look at those shots carefully, you'll find that they're not really following a narrative mode of going from, a distance to slowly to closer to the object. It's not like that. It is only some kind of an if you like, a blow up, an expansion or a magnification of one detail that the filmmaker wants you to notice separately. And often that is circled by some kind of a mask or some kind of an iris. Like, it's not a full frame. There will be a circle, the rest is dark, and you see a big close-up of something. This is like cutting one image, one scene, and showing one particular detail. It follows the technique of some kind of painting or some sort of magnifying glass related magnifying glass augmented reading. It's not really the way we create close shots in a narrative, following a narrative logic, that one would like to go close, see a little bit more. One would like to read a character's mind, you go close to the character. It's not like that. Similarly, here it's not really a short reverse shot. Why I'm saying this is the logic of combination, that you still have a bit of, you have Kaliyamardan, another film, 1919, has sequences where you see almost clear continuity editing. But then it would stop and a tableau narration would begin. The logic behind this combination, so far as I have understood it, is actually a conception of space which is not homogeneous, uniform, like the space that I'm sitting here now, or like the space that you see in a realist film. It's not that. It's kind of, space has denomination. So space either belongs to the Vishwamitra's sacred domain or to the king's profane domain, the opposite of sacred. Because hunting is a profane activity. Hunting is a non-sacred activity. It doesn't belong to the realm of the pavitra. It's ordinary, non-pavitra activity, non-sacred. So, during the hunt, he could take a bit of liberty with the flow and the narration and so on. But the moment he arrives at another kind of space, the sacred space of the ritual, he completely changes. Space is also, you go from tableau to tableau in these films, because One tableau relates to the interior of of the Antapur, the women's quarters, where the queens live in the palace, Raja Harishchandra's. Another would belong to the men's quarters. There's a man-woman divide. Or there is another divide sometimes of the king's place, which is the palace, and the subject, the praja, the ordinary subject's place, which is usually outside the palace. So in this way, man, woman, sacred, profane, subject, king, you can think of other things also. Sometimes good, evil, an activity which relates to something good versus an activity that relates to something evil. This is how space is demarcated and denominated. Now, denominated space is not a freely flowing, continuous logical space. Denomination of space means that within a single kind of area, you will mark this place for the gods, that place for ordinary beings, that one for maybe politics, that's for culture, and so on and so forth. If you go on doing that, you will end up having a kind of conception of space that does not have to be continuous. In fact, it is discontinuous. That is the whole point. Which is why they do not, even though they know the techniques of continuity narration, they do not necessarily follow that. And we shall see this much later in Indian cinema, right into the 1960s, even 70s. We'll see that sometimes denominational space appears very strongly. You have the villain's den where all sorts of bad activity takes place. Gambling, drinking, dancing, cabaret dancing. That's always done in a certain way. The art direction, the scene creation, everything is. And opposed to that, you have a good, dutiful wives, domestic space. This is how the hero and the villain, the good and the bad, the man and the woman would relate to definite kinds of spaces where you do not always need to have a logical progression from what had happened before to this space. Sometimes Indian popular cinema in those days were accused of being illogical. This is the reason. Often. This is not the only reason. This was one of the main reasons.